Deep state, a state within a state. I assume that many of you have heard these ominous synonym terms over the past several years. Political analysts, conspiracy theorists, and leaders of various countries speak about the deep state. But do you know what's the strangest part? Very few can precisely explain what it actually is. Why has the deep state as a concept surpassed the world government in popularity? Everyone keeps circling around it, but cannot say anything substantive. It's understandable. In the modern political and news language, there are no terms as widely circulated, mysterious, yet intuitively understandable as the deep state. A state within a state is a very similar term from the 19th century. Just don't confuse the deep state with the familiar power system. It cannot be seen with the naked eye. The deep state hides behind the facade of public politics in distant offices and reigns from behind the curtains. In general, it does everything to remain unnoticed. This is a very unusual episode which simply has no analogues on YouTube, neither in English nor in any other language. Today, I will tell you how the deep state has taken root in the largest and most influential countries on the planet. We will learn how this system works, what it actually strives for, whom it obeys, and how agonizing a death awaits its opponents. This video is simultaneously about history, the theory of political elites, and conspiratorial thinking. We will examine the deep state in Middle Eastern countries. We will thoroughly analyze this constitution of the USSR. Additionally, we will delve into the details of American intelligence operations, understand why John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and of course, not forget about Donald Trump. And we will dive in as deeply as possible. You are on a channel where interesting stories are not just told, but also explained. Chapter 1. The Emergence of the Deep State. November 1996. Sunday evening. Millions of Turkish citizens, as usual, are calmly watching television before bed and discussing how Fenerbahce or Galatasaray played, when suddenly all the major channels interrupt their broadcast. A scrolling text announces, near the town of Susurluk, which is between Istanbul and Izmir, a car accident occurred. 3 people died, 1 person was injured. At first glance, it seems like ordinary news. Just another traffic accident. Most likely the driver just lost control. But soon everyone understood. The Susurluk accident would forever change the history of Turkey. It is essential to understand who was in the car at that moment. It was the deputy chief of the Istanbul police, 2 unknown persons, and Sedat Bukak, a well-known deputy and commander of militias fighting Kurdish separatists. Among all those in the car, only he survived. Just as a reminder, Kurds are the largest stateless nation in the world, larger than the Romani people. Importantly, unlike the Romani, Kurds have a clear national identity. They live throughout Southwest Asia, and the largest population is in Turkey. For over a century, they have been fighting for independence, and the Turkish state opposes them in this. Let us return to the accident. When the authorities began investigating the car accident, it became clear that along with the deputy and the deputy chief of police, Abdullah Katli was killed. This news quickly became a sensation. Abdullah was the head of the organization of Turkish nationalists known outside of Turkey as the Grey Wolves. Turkish authorities had been searching for Katli for almost 20 years. He had a long trail of murders behind him. In Europe, he had been imprisoned for heroin trafficking. His associates had even attempted to assassinate the Pope. In 1990, Abdullah escaped from a Swiss prison 11 years before the Mexican El Chapo. Later, it was discovered that Katli's beloved died in the accident. She had a counterfeit green passport with her, a type typically issued to officials. So, a very strange group had gathered in the crashed car. A police chief, a deputy known for his fight against the Kurds, a criminal figure on the Interpol's list, and his girlfriend. It seemed like a cast from a classic mafia film. The notorious crash made Turkish society pause and reflect. What were these state figures doing in the same car with a terrorist? What did they want from him, or he from them? The next day, Turkey's largest newspaper came out with a headline, "The state is aware of the corruption." The political system overnight dropped the public's trust in it to unprecedented levels. We tell everyone around us that the main ultra-right terrorist is wanted. Yet here, a deputy and a high-ranking official from the Ministry of Internal Affairs are calmly driving around the country with him. The Prime Minister stated that the situation is more serious than we think and than people know. Involved are the military, police officers, politicians and mafiosi. The news poured in one after another. As a protest, each evening millions of Turks turned off their lights at home for a minute. Mass street protests began across the country. A special parliamentary commission took on the investigation of this event. But then the case quickly drowned in paperwork. The scandal was hushed up. The deputy, who survived the crash, quietly returned to politics. The media quickly explained that he was not a criminal figure, but had always taken the side of the authorities on the Kurdish issue. After the scandalous crash, it became apparent. The government wanted to solve the Kurdish issue so badly that it was ready to work with people whose hands were stained with blood up to the elbows. Operations against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which had literally 2 months before officially declared a ceasefire, apparently were more convenient to carry out through third parties in those years, and representatives of the state turned their attention to those whom the state would ordinarily gladly imprison for decades. At that moment, it became clear to many in Turkey that the state was entangled with the mafia, and on an international scale at that. A crisis triggered by merely one car accident set off a chain of changes. The Turkish military, as often happens there, went on the offensive. They issued a public ultimatum to the Prime Minister, forcing him to resign. This maneuver was called a postmodern coup, the first time in history that power in Turkey changed hands not through military arms but through words and the strength of public opinion. And this was only the first blow. The ruling party was banned, and its leader, Prime Minister Erbakan, who was referred to as the founder of modern political Islam, was barred from politics for 5 years. It was then that his pupil and successor, the mayor of Istanbul named Recep Tayyip Erdogan, came to the forefront. In 2001, Erdogan would establish his own party, and a year later, it would win the elections. The Susurluk car accident was not forgotten by anyone, especially Erdogan. It was after this event that a new expression entered common use in Turkey. Derin devlet, the deep state, a parallel and highly non-transparent structure of governance in the country. The very deep state that 20 years later would become a topic of discussion worldwide. Chapter 2. Derin devlet. We didn't start our story with America, Russia, or the European Union, but with Turkey for a reason. This country is not coincidentally the birthplace of the concept of the deep state. The deep state can only be understood by starting with a small historical background. The Ottomans, originally a small principality, became a key force in Europe, Asia, and Africa from the 15th century onward. They controlled the Balkans, the Middle East, North Africa, and lands from Hungary to Crimea and the Caucasus. Their foreign policy and military activities were disliked by many, but starting from around the 17th century, the empire began to decline gradually. Military defeats, economic crises, ineffectual rulers. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was given the derogatory nickname the sick man of Europe. Interestingly, of Europe despite the fact that it then included present-day Syria, Iraq and Kuwait. When an empire weakens, the rise of nationalism and the oppression of minorities often stem from a feeling of vulnerability towards them rather than a position of strength. This is a fairly common practice. As a result, in 1908, power was seized by an organization of nationalist officers, the Committee of Union and Progress. They were also called the Young Turks. Among the Young Turks was the future Ataturk, the founding father of modern Turkey. But at that time, he was still far from high positions. The Young Turks promised to transform the Turkish Sultanate into a parliamentary democracy. But in reality, a triumvirate emerged in the country. 3 pashas, or 3 autocrats, behind whom stood a large, complex network of power and criminal structures. The influence of the Young Turks was maintained, among other things, by the support of criminal syndicates, especially in the eastern part of the country, where it was always restless. The behind-the-scenes intrigues in which the fading empire became entangled led it to catastrophe. World War, the Armenian genocide, the genocide of the Pontic Greeks, and the disintegration of the country. The Young Turks ruled for a short time, but they laid the foundation for the country's political culture, with constant conspiracies and secret behind-the-scenes struggles. After the Young Turks, it was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk who came to power. Of course, he was an autocrat, and yes, he had a lot of power. But like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, he used it more for good. Relying on military officers, he began to build his mega-project, a modern, secular and westernized Turkey. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's set of views began to be referred to as Kemalism. And if we imagine the history of Turkey as a pendulum, Kemalism acts as the perfect center. To the left, a secular state of the Western European type. To the right, Islamism, political Islam, in which the country lived for centuries. And for 100 years now, since the time of Ataturk, this pendulum has been grinding down the so-called deep state. The regime deviates from Kemalism to the right towards the ideas of the Sultanate. The military steps in to assert control, or they try to do so. If it goes too much to the left, the same story repeats. Again, the system comes into balance under the influence of internal forces. This encapsulates Turkish history in the 20th century. After Ataturk's death in 1938, his associate initially held the country under strict control. But after World War II, he allowed a multi-party system. In the 1950s, the Democrats came to power for the first time. Liberalization began, though only partially. As a result, in 1960, the military staged their first coup. The Prime Minister was executed and officers seized power. Since then, the army has remained a significant force in politics. The 1970s and 1980s were chaotic for the country. Turkey was coming apart at the seams. The economy was in decline. Students and left-wing activists protested against the junta. The junta killed them. And then there were the Kurds and Islamists. In 1980, the military once again took control. But this time, they tightened the screws to a full-blown military dictatorship. The generals relinquished power only in 1983. However, by that time, the state apparatus had changed significantly. A new force had emerged in the shadows, the deep state. In the case of Turkey, this expression referred to a strange alliance of intelligence services, criminal elements, and nationalists. Already in the 1970s, Turkish leaders openly stated that a hidden force operated within the country, one not subordinate to the army. One prime minister even claimed there are two states in Turkey, one inside the other. Naturally, no names were mentioned, because any investigation might lead back to oneself. After a notable incident in the 1990s, serious discussions about the deep state began. It ceased to be merely a beautiful metaphor. It became evident that the deep state influenced and altered the political landscape of the country. It was precisely the protest against the deep state that brought Erdogan's party to power. In 2002, he promised to bring to light the forces that, according to him, had been inherited by Turkey from the Ottoman Empire. Since then, any political crisis has invariably been linked to some conspiracy. This was not even considered conspiracy theorizing. Debates about the deep state took place in parliamentary sessions and on television shows. Wherever one looked, there were agents of the deep state, in parliament, in government, in the media. The left-wing party accused the deep state of orchestrating the shooting of demonstrators on May 1, 1977, where dozens were killed. Conversely, the right sought deep state money in the labor movement. Yet all parties agreed on one point. The deep state existed. It skillfully concealed itself and disregarded any laws. By the mid-2000s, the rhetoric had intensified. Erdogan declared that a war was being waged against the deep state. It needed to be completely destroyed. In 2008, a legal crusade began against the ultra-right organization Ergenekon. Even before the notorious incident, they were suspected of having covertly operated the country for years. At that time, military personnel, politicians, businessmen and journalists were put on trial. Over 2 years, there were 13 waves of arrests. 200 people ended up behind bars, including high-ranking generals. It was a triumph for the new government, marking the long-awaited end of the era of the deep state. However, the topic did not fade away. The story continued to be inflated. It turns out the convicted individuals were planning Operation Sledgehammer, involving terrorist attacks and mass unrest across the country. The authorities painted a picture suggesting that Turkish democracy miraculously remained standing. Yet, it would be a mistake to consider the deep state merely a propagandistic scare tactic or a tool of political struggle. In Turkey's case, opponents of the deep state had quite real grounds to suspect internal elite conspiracies. By the early 2010, discussions about the deep state subsided. There were fewer stories in the media, and debates faded away. However, the moment another coup attempt occurred, such as in 2016, rumours of a deep state conspiracy resurfaced. Even now, no one can definitively say whether Recep Erdogan managed to bring the deep state under control, or if it will make itself known again. Yet, if the deep state exists not just as a concept but as an entity, it certainly wasn't invented in Istanbul. Chapter 3. Everywhere and all at once. Strictly speaking, signs of the deep state can be found in virtually any country. It suffices for there to be a structure engaging in secret intelligence, counterintelligence, and other operations to be categorized as special services or secret agencies. Importantly, this isn't just any intelligence service in the world, but one that becomes such an independent player that it can act against the political leadership of the country, defying its will. Or another possibility exists without informing it, an autonomous state within a state with significant resources and minimal public visibility. In this chapter, let's soar over the world map. For instance, look at Pakistan. Their intelligence service conducted operations in Afghanistan with CIA support. They are also accused of sabotage in India, ties with Arab terrorists, and religious radicals in China and the Philippines. With such a portfolio, they only belong to the deep state. Now let's consider sunny Thailand. There, the so-called network monarchy operated for almost 20 years. An informal elite wielded tremendous power, rallying around the king. And this in the 20th century, when the country already had a formidable army and bureaucrats. Another potential format of the deep state is the Turkish model, which we just examined, involving not only intelligence but a coalition of military intelligence services and criminal elements. They all secretly operate independently of democratically elected authorities. Another classic example of the deep state is military juntas, initially formed through conspiracies of specific senior military officials who scorn the weak-willed political elite. For example, the black colonels in Greece who established a harsh dictatorship in the country in the 1960s, cancelled parliamentary elections, and later sent tanks against protesting students. Or the dictatorships in South America, where militaristic regimes were literally everywhere. In Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Ecuador. Even Costa Rica experienced a military coup, quite surprisingly, in 1917. In Chile under Pinochet, the military controlled not only the government, but also a large part of the economy. Under their supervision, both the Chilean economic miracle and the death flights occurred, when political prisoners were drugged, then taken up in helicopters into the sky and thrown from a height into the ocean. Truly flights in dreams and reality. In European countries, discussions about the deep state also surface regularly, more often than you might think. In Estonia, for example, there is also a term, suvarik. In Switzerland, theories about hidden mechanisms of power became mainstream back in the 1980s. The reason for this was rather loud. It turned out that the Swiss intelligence services had been spying on their own citizens for many years. In Britain, the deep state is necessarily liberal and pro-European. A former advisor to Boris Johnson mentioned that the real power in the country belongs not to the ministers, but to high-ranking officials. That is, not to elected leaders, but to certain bureaucrats. They were supposedly the ones hindering Britain's exit from the European Union, and it would be concluded that there was a conspiracy of the deep state with the aim of burying Brexit. And indeed, many would come to such a conclusion. In the homeland of the Freemasons, such theories cannot help but be popular. In the 20th century, any structure with suspiciously much power was called a state within a state. So it was not necessarily a label pasted only on local intelligence services. In the United States, Germany, and Israel, this suspicion fell upon trade unions. In Latin America, the United Fruit Company Corporation. In the countries of North Africa and the Middle East, the Arab Spring changed everything. When in 2011 a wave of democratic uprisings, or coup d'état, depending on your perspective, swept across the Middle East and then abruptly receded with tremendous force. And that was when the deep state was spoken of in Arabic as well. For instance, in Egypt. In 2011, the regime of Hosni Mubarak was experiencing a severe crisis. Social problems, corruption and state apparatus inefficiency significantly reduced his power. Mubarak had ruled the country for almost 30 years, but after just a few weeks of unrest, it all ended. But at that time, in 2011, when people around the world were following the events in Egypt, they didn't know that all those years the regime had a double bottom. Behind the facade stood a much more powerful force than the charismatic leader. The real deep state in Egypt was the military. Without it, the change of power would not have occurred. The military is the backbone of the Egyptian deep state. Besides it, the deep state rests on 4 more pillars. These are the intelligence services, police, controlled courts, and media. Together, they ensure stability and maintain the status quo, so you don't fear flying to the beaches of Sharm el-Sheikh. The army took control of the Egyptian deep state in 1952, when Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power. Over 60 years, the military transformed Egypt's economy into one vast state corporation. They controlled hotels, restaurants, factories, oil companies, even the production of pasta and olive oil. After the peace treaty with Israel in 1978, the military realized that trade brings more money than war. They then invested in construction, tourism, and agricultural business. In addition, the United States annually provided Egypt with $1.3 billion for peace with Israel and an anti-Soviet stance. The money flowed abundantly, and the army became increasingly entrenched in the economy. The extent of the military's influence in Egypt remains unknown to this day, but by various estimates, they control anywhere from a quarter to half of the entire country's economy. Hosni Mubarak came to power in 1981, and for 30 years the deep state was content with him. Everything changed due to one fatal mistake. The president publicly began preparing a successor who was independent of the army. The deep state could not allow such a thing. Therefore, when protests against Mubarak began in the country, the army simply stood aside and watched as the president lost power. The police alone could no longer manage the crowd. Later they issued a statement, "We guarantee the fulfillment of all the people's demands." This was a clear signal to the entire world. The president was ousted. The deep state deftly outmaneuvered the ruler who had grown tiresome. And this was only the beginning. A year later, a new Islamist president was elected to replace Mubarak. The deep state simply could not allow power to remain with him for long. One must understand that the military in Egypt has always had a poor attitude toward Islamists and religious radicals. The military, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the courts sabotaged any action by the new president. He found himself entirely without levers of influence. Half of Egypt simply did not listen to him. The president's supporters immediately claimed that the deep state was hindering democracy. Opponents turned the narrative around and said that it was the Islamist deep state imposing a reactionary course. Reforms stalled. The country suddenly came to a standstill. Egypt's economy crumbled, and the security forces added fuel to the fire. It was the perfect storm. An energy crisis, religious conflicts, mass brawls of football fans. In general, the new president did not rule for long. When protests against the head of state began in 2013, the police calmly watched as people ransacked the headquarters of the Islamists. And do you know what's most interesting? As soon as the president resigned, fuel problems in the country ended, lights turned on everywhere, and the police finally went back to work. Egypt is now ruled by General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. His portraits are everywhere in Cairo. He is called the Arab Eagle and the man who can be trusted. Even a year before Mubarak's overthrow, while still in military service, this general stated in a report to the Minister of Defense that in the event of an uprising, the army should side with the protesters. Chapter 4. Nomenclature. This story from the world of football is almost perfect for understanding how the Soviet deep state was organized. Look, Since sometime in the late 1940s, the favorite club of the Leningraders, Zenit, remained a solid mid-table team in the USSR Championship. The club was managed by trade unions, coaches changed constantly, and discipline was lacking. In short, that Zenit was not at all like it is now. And in 1967, they had the most disastrous season in the club's history. 8 players were expelled from the team, including the promising Gennady Orlov, who would later become a football commentator. The lineup changed so often that the players didn't even know who was who in their team. During training camps, team members got so drunk on the train that they ended up in a big brawl. Everyone understood that relegation from the top league was inevitable, and according to memories, they all resigned themselves. Leningrad was preparing for life without major football. But then, in the spring of 1967, a few rounds before the end of the season, a meeting was held in the Leningrad Regional Committee. There, the party overseer of Zenit explained the grand plans to develop football in Leningrad. Soon, rumors spread throughout the city that Zenit would not be allowed to be relegated from the top league. And the decision was made personally by the first secretary of the Leningrad Regional Committee of the CPSU, what we might now call the governor, Vasily Tolstyakov. He rightly judged. The Soviet government would soon have an anniversary. 50 years since the event of 1917. But it would be disgraceful if a team from Leningrad, the city of 3 revolutions, were to be relegated on such a date. At the Kirov Stadium in Leningrad, Zenit played against Torpedo, and the head of the Football Federation decreed that from now on there would not be 19 but 20 teams in the championship. We won't embarrass Leningrad, even though this contradicted all the rules, and years later he confessed that on the phone line between the regional and central committee, he was instructed to make it appear that the decision formally came from the Federation, not from Moscow. The official version of this maneuver was that the Federation fulfilled the will of Leningrad fans, that they supposedly requested this very strongly. You see, all power lies in the hands of the Soviet people, and not a word about the anniversary of the revolution. And this is only the tip of the iceberg of the shadow schemes of Soviet football. There are well-known stories of when the head of state, Leonid Brezhnev, personally chose which players would play for which teams. Volodymyr Shcherbitsky, the head of the Ukrainian SSR, personally handled all matters regarding Dynamo Kyiv, although the club formerly had its own leaders, and the people of Kyiv, thanks to a strict administrative resource and a direct line with the Republic's leadership, successfully took advantage of this. It is unknown where Moscow's Spartak would be without Brezhnev's close associate, Konstantin Ustinovich Chernenko, a supporter of Spartak, and not without Yeltsin's predecessor in the position of head of Moscow, Viktor Grishin, who also supported the football club Spartak. They gave the team a very good sponsor, Aeroflot, and constantly resolved administrative issues using the same spine-right principle. They made a call and resolved it. And in precisely the same manner that Zenit remained in the league, in 1976, the relegated Spartak could have stayed. The administrative intrigue fell apart at the last moment. There was no football manager in those years. People entertained themselves as best they could. Not fair, you say? Not sporty? Should sports be separated from politics? Friends, what can there even be to discuss when the interests of the most influential party bosses are at stake? There's a saying, the entire ocean is reflected in a single drop of water. Thus, in how the Soviet football bureaucracy operated, one could see the entire Soviet state system, how it was supposed to work formally, by the laws, by the documents, and how it really operated. If approached formally, one could open the constitution of the USSR, regardless of the year, and arrive at an obvious answer. Citizens first elect local councils, then nominate candidates for the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, the highest governing body. The Supreme Soviet confirms the Council of Ministers, that is, the government. The Supreme Soviet also appoints the Prosecutor General and the composition of the Supreme Court. In the brotherly republics, everything is more or less the same. They have their own Supreme Soviets, councils of ministers, judges and prosecutors. Everything seems apparent. The Soviet Union was governed by the Soviets, hence the slogan that all power to the Soviets. The smaller council elects a larger council. And since the Soviets were elected by the citizens, it follows that all power in the Soviet Union belonged to the people. The people exercised state power through the Soviets, as stated in the second article of the 1977 Constitution. But this was what the Soviet Constitution stated, which was perceived as something formal. The reality was slightly different. The country was ruled by the party elite, headed by the Central Committee and its Politburo, a special class of managers that was not prescribed in any constitution. You can open the 1977 Constitution, the Brezhnev one, and search for the word Politburo in the text. You will be disappointed. In the text of the Stalin Constitution, it's also zero. Because public Soviet politics were decorative and ceremonial, that is to say, non-existent. Western experts, Sovietologists and intelligence residents, unless they had leaked documents or intelligence reports, were forced to pore over newspaper articles and analyze who stood next to whom at the mausoleum to understand the balance of Soviet power. All those involved in party and government work professionally understood that all real politics happened behind the scenes, under the carpet. And this was indeed a state within a state, the Soviet deep state.
Это очень хорошо, товарищ. Это показатель высокой политической зрелости.
Why can we even call the situation in the Soviet Union a rule of the deep state? A very simple example shows the huge difference between who governed on paper and who ruled in reality. You are probably thinking that the highest position in the Soviet state is the General Secretary of the party. But no. Formerly, the main person in the Soviet state was not the General Secretary. The position held by Gorbachev, Andropov, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, who at that time was still the first secretary. According to the Constitution, the head of the Soviet Union was the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. This position was the highest. In the West, some analysts even referred to the people in this post as the President of the Soviet Union for ease of understanding. Who formerly headed the Soviet Union? For example, this man, Vasily Vasilyevich Kuznetsov. He served as the acting head of the USSR 3 times. Surely you do not know him? Or this respected party official, Nikolai Podgorny. He was the main person in the Soviet state for as many as 12 years. And even when Gorbachev came to power, he did not rush to immediately create the post of President of the Soviet Union. Under him, the head of state position was held by Andrei Gromyko for 3 years. That is, once again, most people in the country might not have even known the surname of the formal head of state and were accustomed to the saying one thing but doing another. And real decision-makers, the people making decisions, as they are called in political science faculties, were invisible. Another example. In the Soviet Union, such a state award existed, the Order of Lenin, which was given to particularly meritorious party and state officials. I bet that no one or very few people remember the name of the person who was awarded this order a record 11 times. His name was Nikolai Patolichev, who was first the head of Belarus, then the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then for many years led the Ministry of Foreign Trade of the USSR, an 11-time recipient. That is, Khrushchev 7 times, Brezhnev 8 times, and Patolichev, who was not even a member of the Politburo, was awarded this honor 11 times. And beyond Belarus, he was unlikely remembered or known at all. How did the Soviet deep state work in practice at the lower levels of the hierarchy? If an initiative came from below, everything started with a letter to the party committee. Some department would write what it wanted, why it needed it, and would propose how the problem could be solved. But if the idea came from above, from the party committee itself or former leadership, a couple of words were enough. In cases of a directive from above, the process always moved faster. This might sound to you like some sort of bureaucratic tedium, but it is this very bureaucratic tedium that forms the decision-making system on which the lives of tens of millions of people depended. Then the work on the text began. The committee secretary would assign the task of preparing the documents to the head of the department. He would pass on the task to the head of the sector and he to an ordinary employee. A lot of bureaucratic work, and the efficiency was lacking because no one planned to write the text, and they couldn't ask ChatGPT to do it then. Each person just passed on the instructions further down the chain. The ordinary employee was always the one at fault, but he was not a fool either. Before sitting down with the document, it was better to discuss it with colleagues and share the responsibility. As is customary now, back then no one consulted lawyers. The finished text moved up the same chain. Eventually it reached the secretary of the committee. When the text was brought to completion, it was put to a vote. Leaders whom the project concerned were invited only for their agenda item. The others had to languish in the waiting room. If a discussion was not needed, the text was simply circulated to the bureau, where it was signed, and the matter was resolved. Almost all decisions in the Soviet Union were made this way. But the bureaucracy did not end there. After approval, the document was recorded in a protocol, assigned a number, and then sent by special communication to the necessary department. Members of the party committee could familiarize themselves with it, but could not take it for themselves. Absolutely not. Everything followed strict rules. The Soviet decision-making system is reflected in the saying, "The issue has not been resolved, but it is predetermined." In translation from Soviet bureaucratic jargon, it meant that the apparatus had already prepared the text, and the rest was mere formality. Meanwhile, Soviet satire, to its credit, regularly mocked this decision-making process, particularly in the 1980s, in the satirical newsreel Fitil, or in cartoons in Crocodile. The decision to rescue the club in the anniversary year of the revolution was made in the Leningrad Regional Committee, or even higher, directly in the Central Committee. But the public was presented as if the Football Federation was behind it all, because it was important to show the facade. Why involve people in all the details of decision-making? Again, there are countless such examples at all levels. The Soviet deep state, unlike the Turkish and Egyptian ones, was far more almighty. Informally, issues were resolved everywhere, from Gosplan to the clinic. Any state entity, from a collective farm to the Council of Ministers, was obliged to follow the orders of the party nomenclature. No law or decree was adopted without the approval of the party committee. The nomenclatura decided all matters of the universe, from the dispatch of arms to Nicaragua to the appointment of the head of the district library in the city of Saratov. The deep state undoubtedly is not a Soviet invention. Informal government structures existed even in Tsarist Russia, but only in the USSR, partly thanks to the development of communications and progress, did the deep state reach industrial capacity. We do not have exact data on how many members of the party nomenclature there were in the Soviet Union. The lists were classified for a long time, and part of them, unfortunately, remains closed. Soviet sociologist Mikhail Voslensky, in his seminal book Nomenklatura, gives the number of 750,000 people. Together with their families, about 3 million, that is, around 1% of the population, who were the most influential social stratum in the state. What is especially important? The party nomenclaturists were not state officials, and their power was far broader than that of the ordinary bureaucracy. What was initially intended, under Lenin, as bodies of workers' control over production and economy, transformed into a vast network of state governance. The difference between a classic bureaucrat and a representative of the Soviet nomenclatura deep state is simple. The former executes orders, while the latter issues them. The former relies on the formal letter of the law, which simultaneously constrains and protects him. The nomenclatura member is a free bird, with access to Beryozka stores and exclusive schools where he can enroll his children. Therefore, when during Gorbachev's era it became fashionable to criticize the nomenclatura for its vast privileges, even supporters of preserving the Soviet Union, the staunch conservatives, opponents of Yeltsin, refrained from defending representatives of this class. The nomenclatura surrounded itself with a veil of secrecy. Positions, lists, appointments, all were kept in strict confidence, although in the lists of positions themselves, the original meaning of the word nomenclatura, list of positions, there was nothing particularly secretive. The main thing was the system they cemented. We've examined Turkey and the Soviet Union with Egypt as well. Now I propose moving on to other protagonists of our discourse and examining what the deep state has wrought in the United States of America. Chapter 5. The Deep State in the United States. This is Dwight Eisenhower, a general World War II hero, recipient of the Soviet Order of Victory and the 34th President of the United States. You will now hear his farewell address. Soon, he will leave the White House forever.
Is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government.
Eisenhower warns that the military-industrial complex will sooner or later jeopardize American democracy itself. And these are not empty words. The president knew exactly what he was talking about. World War II permanently changed the states. Before it, Americans never maintained too large an army, nor did they invest so heavily in defense. But after they witnessed the rise of Hitler's influence in Europe, that scheme ceased to work. By the fall of 1939, the Council on Foreign Relations launched a secret study. It was called the War-Peace Studies. The project was generously sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. The main question was obvious: what threat does the new war in Europe pose to America? The researchers concluded that the country would have to reinvent the concept of security. The logic is simple. Previously, security was perceived narrowly. Primarily, it was about the protection of land and sea borders and the presence of a combat-ready army. But in the modern world, everything turned out to be too interconnected. Even the states couldn't simply sit back across the ocean if anything were to happen. Scientific and technological progress made the military threat transatlantic, global. Considering that the Nazis nearly invented the atomic bomb a few years later, the idea proved to be prophetic. After the end of World War II, the so-called national security system was conceived in the United States. Since threats had become global, it was necessary to always be ready and vigilant. The pillars of the system became the military, intelligence services, diplomacy, and the military-industrial complex. Let's note that national security during the Cold War became the core of US policy. It is from this that the local deep state would later grow. A turning point was the National Security Act of the year 1947. It laid the foundation for the creation of the very CIA, NSA, and National Security Council. These new agencies quickly aligned with the general line and began fighting against communism, both real and imagined. Notably, the Department of War, which had operated since the times of George Washington, was immediately renamed the Department of Defense. By 1947, the United States was at its peak. For the prior decades, it had already been the richest country in the world. And then, Europe and half of Asia lay in ruins. Let's not forget about the atomic bomb. In general, the local elite realized that they could shape the international order to their advantage. But first, they had to work at home. Firstly, any isolationism had to be nipped in the bud. That is, attempts to refrain from US participation in addressing significant global issues were to be thwarted. Isolationism was not even given a chance. The refusal to disarm was adopted secretly within the closed circle of the elite. No public discussions or votes were held. Then American propaganda got involved. To make it appear more humane, emphasis was placed on the protection of the peoples of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And to save Europe from communism? Is there a mission more noble? Thus, the myth of the United States as a benevolent hegemon was born, serving as an alternative to the Soviet Union and the prospect of global communism. This concept was very aptly described by Samuel Huntington, an advisor to American presidents and the author of the famous work, The Clash of Civilizations. The power architects in the US were to create a force that could be felt, but not seen. Power remains strong while hidden in the dark. Once exposed to the light, it begins to evaporate. However, we now have the opportunity to introduce the very person who shed light on the American deep state. This person was Frank Church, a monumental figure, by the way. Church became a US senator in the 1950s. As it is now said, he was a hawk of the Cold War. Church served in World War II in Army intelligence in China. Initially, he was an ordinary conformist, trying not to get involved in any issues. But somewhere in the 1960s, his views began to change. The United States was burying itself ever deeper in Vietnam. In 1962, Church visited the front line and then became the first senator in the country to recognize that the official version of events was questionable. From a staunch fighter against communism, he transformed into the system's most vocal critic. By the late 1960s, in unison with hippies in torn jeans, he openly spoke out against the Vietnam War. To him, it was not just a disgraceful war far from home, but also a threat to America itself. Church understood that under the pretext of security, American intelligence agencies were increasing their control over the state and society. At that time, this seemed like paranoia to many. Soon, the Vietnam War ended. When this is discussed, people often recall the Summer of Love and anti-war marches. However, it wasn't John Lennon's songs that halted the combat operations, but the decision by Congress to cut military spending. Frank Church was among those who made and pushed through this decision, but his main battle with the so-called state within a state was yet to come. On the evening of June 17, 1972, an American television channel was showing a horror movie called Attack of the Puppet People. It wasn't a particularly good B-movie. The film was being watched in a Washington apartment opposite the Watergate office complex where Alfred Baldwin was at the time. He became so engrossed in the plot that he forgot his main task was to stand lookout while 5 men installed bugging devices at the Democratic Party headquarters. Alfred failed to notice a police car approaching. As a result, around 3 in the morning, they were all caught red-handed with pens, cameras, and radio receivers. One of the accomplices turned out to be CIA agent James McCord. President Nixon, a Republican, declared that the White House had nothing to do with the attack on the Democrats. Initially, Americans even believed him, but eventually the truth was uncovered by the Washington Post. America learned that the president had lied and that Nixon's campaign headquarters was eavesdropping on opponents. With each new wave of news on the topic, the president's approval ratings plummeted. When the court hearings were broadcasted, Nixon's political career was effectively over.
That in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The first to break was former CIA agent James McCord. He gave up everyone involved, naming names, amounts, and clients. Among them were former FBI and CIA employees from Nixon's headquarters. He revealed how the president personally hired people to clean up incriminating material and dig up dirt on competitors. They were also known as the White House plumbers. Most likely they were the ones who broke into the Watergate complex. In the end, one person received a prison sentence. Richard Nixon resigned a year later. This remains a unique story in American politics, but the main question remained unanswered. Did the president know about the break-in? And why did the investigation keep bringing up the mysterious trio of letters, FBI and CIA? The scandals did not end there. Shortly after Nixon's resignation, in December 1974, the New York Times published an article by now legendary journalist Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize winner who wrote about the My Lai massacre and extensively covered the Watergate scandal. Hersh revealed a sensational story that the CIA had been spying on Americans for years, especially on anti-war activists. Frank Church immediately supported the journalist. At that time, he was following the influence of American corporations around the world. In a surprising turn of events, it was revealed that the events in Chile, the most anti-communist country after the United States and South Korea, suspiciously bore the marks of the CIA. Hersh and Church came to the same conclusion. The intelligence agencies had a much stronger influence on the country's foreign and domestic policies than anyone could have imagined. Washington was shaken. On the wave of scandals, the Democrats swept the Republicans in the elections of the year 1974. Certain politicians, like Nixon, were carried out feet first, ending their careers. As soon as they gained control of Congress, they got right to work and began to dig. Society needed to know who, where, and how exceeded their powers. And here Frank Church felt his hands were untied. However, unexpectedly, the newly elected President Gerald Ford threw a wrench in the works. Let's not forget that in the United States there is the principle of the separation of powers. The policies of the Senate and the President do not have to coincide, especially when it comes to the deep state. Pressure on Church's committee increased, and this is not just a figure of speech. 3 key witnesses mysteriously died, right before giving testimony. There is no evidence or concrete facts that this was the doing of the CIA or someone from the president's team. But the coincidence seemed suspicious to many. In the spring of 1976, the committee finally released the final report on the influence of the intelligence services on the United States in 6 volumes. And it was a real information bomb, one of the key works for any self-respecting critic of the deep state. Let's take it step by step. First, the National Security Act of the year 1947 did not grant the CIA the right to conduct covert operations. Officially, the agency was supposed to only collect data, advise and coordinate the work of the National Security Council. But very quickly, the CIA turned into a true factory of covert operations. Some of them were approved by the White House. Sometimes the operatives worked at their discretion. By the 1970s, the CIA had effectively turned into a shadow government that was not accountable to anyone at all. The architects of this secret leviathan were the Dulles brothers. One was the Secretary of State, the other the head of the CIA, whose fake plan to undermine the USSR from within was widely circulated in Russian for quite some time. Meanwhile, in the States, there was a broadly circulated fake plan of Khrushchev to undermine the morale of American society and turn everyone there into communists. We will look at the facts. Allen Dulles indeed turned the CIA into an exclusive elite structure. It answered to a narrow circle of individuals, including the president. His brother John Dulles, at that time, held the post of Secretary of State. Both were closely connected with the business elite. Under their leadership, the CIA ensured the United States access to key resources: oil in Iran, bananas in Guatemala, and minerals in Africa. Even before the final report was published, the Church Committee released an interim report detailing which foreign leaders the CIA might have assassinated. Primarily, these were autocrats and rebellious generals unfavorable to Washington from Zaire, the Dominican Republic, South Vietnam, and Chile. The most famous, of course, was the untouchable Fidel Castro. The Kennedy administration attempted to negotiate with mafia bosses to poison Castro. All attempts failed. President Ford tried to suppress the report but could not succeed. Under pressure from the committee, he signed an executive order that prohibited intelligence agencies from assassinating foreign leaders. Such was the state of affairs. What else did we learn from this investigation, for instance, about Operation Shamrock? Major U.S. telecommunications companies were providing the National Security Agency, NSA, with data on millions of calls and messages. By the 1970s, almost every self-respecting politician and dissident, including Frank Church himself, was under surveillance. Or take Operation HT Lingual. In the 1950s, the CIA and FBI opened and photographed 200,000 paper letters without warrants or notifications, simply as a precaution. The CIA, to varying degrees, was involved in coups from Guatemala to Iran, from Chile to the Congo, monitored anti-war activists and Black Power movement leaders in the US, allied with large corporations and suppressed trade unions and social movements. All this happened without oversight, often without even informing the president, regardless of the president's political party. Interestingly, the computer system where espionage data on the CIA's own operatives was collected was called Hydra. The Church Commission also investigated the assassination of John F. Kennedy, interviewed 50 witnesses, and analyzed 3,000 documents. Senators concluded that the CIA's conspiracies against foreign leaders, especially in Cuba, might have been somewhat connected to the president's assassination. They accused the intelligence agencies of negligence. The Kennedy assassination, they claimed, was terribly investigated, but no further specifics were provided. The Church Commission's Senate reports represent the largest intelligence leak in history. Journalists referred to the senator as the American Cicero, because, like the Roman, he urged the country to move away from imperial principles and return to the ideals of the Republic. Latin American countries, especially Chile, took issue with the US after the report. In Europe, discussions began about the powers of intelligence agencies. The USSR initially reacted with an "I told you so" response, and then started spinning stories that the CIA overthrew President Allende in Chile and orchestrated a coup in Iran in 1953. Indeed, they attempted to assassinate Fidel Castro. In the US, things gradually returned to their previous state. No significant laws binding the hands of intelligence agencies were passed. Thus, a warrant was now required for eavesdropping. The CIA was prohibited from assassinating leaders of other countries, but no one forbade working with intermediaries and proxies who would do the job, right? Later, the administration of Ronald Reagan revived covert operations. The deep state in America, unlike in the USSR, was more intelligence agency-oriented than bureaucratic, and chose not to reinvent the wheel, but rather tread the well-worn path. He supported Latin American dictators, financed changes in political regimes, and engaged in similar activities. The most famous example is, of course, the Iran-Contra affair, also known as Iran Gate. What was it about? In those years, the US Congress prohibited the funding of the Contras in Nicaragua as a counter to the USSR and the sale of weapons to Iran. But the intelligence agencies, surprise, surprise, did both. When the scheme was exposed, a huge scandal erupted, but unlike Watergate, there were no high-profile resignations. The event did not even affect Reagan's ratings. Our goals then and now are the restoration of relations with Iran, the honorable conclusion of the Gulf War, and the cessation of state-sponsored terrorism in the Middle East. Almost every major political scandal in the United States after World War II has been somehow tied to the deep state. But the most surprising thing is that the deep state simply weathered the upheaval of the 1970s, becoming even craftier and more resilient. However, if you talked about this too loudly, you were labelled a paranoid, concocting nonsense. But what if a great fan of such conspiracy theories were to suddenly become president and move into the White House? Donald Trump hates the deep state.
Here's my plan to dismantle the deep state and reclaim our democracy from Washington corruption once and for all.
There were tens, hundreds, if not thousands of tweets, remarks, statements and interviews. And Trump in this regard is far from an exception. Every politician in America who wants to appeal to their target audience declares a hatred of bureaucracy. Every one of the last presidents in the States entered the White House with a wagon and a small cart of campaign promises to throttle the cumbersome state structure reminiscent of a swamp. But then, they had to face reality. As a result, in the short span of 4 years, or even 8 years if they were lucky enough to have 2 terms, they managed to fulfill, by the grace of God, about 15–20% of what was promised. On one hand, this is seemingly beneficial, as strong institutions limit not only good but also foolish decisions. You can't just casually approve something, the system holds its ground. But on the other hand, even beneficial projects get stretched over years, and elections aren't far off. You spend years working on some reform, and it might take 10 more years to come into effect, offering no immediate political points for you or your party. So, where is the fairness in that, one might ask? And then there's the sinister American deep state, and everything can be blamed on it. Ronald Reagan was convinced that secret liberals in the State Department were sabotaging his crusade against communism. George Bush didn't trust independent prosecutors. Bill Clinton believed the FBI was out of control. George W. Bush's administration clashed with intelligence after September 11th. Barack Obama was allegedly prevented by the deep state from closing Guantanamo and supposedly forced to send even more troops to Afghanistan. Each of these US presidents, whose last names you still remember well, spoke about all this quite publicly. But no one has ever criticized officials and intelligence agencies as fiercely as Donald Trump. The term deep state emerged in the public agenda in 2017, immediately following his inauguration. Trump and his supporters referred to the deep state as all their enemies within the political elite, or more simply, the Washington swamp, another important term in Trumpism. The official party line was that bureaucrats from federal departments, especially the law enforcement agencies, were sabotaging the president's orders. Trump and his aide Steve Bannon claimed that Obama had orchestrated a deep state attack on the new administration. It all began with Trump's claims that Obama ordered his phone to be tapped during the 2016 campaign. 10 years have passed, yet Donald has not provided any evidence. But why did a term previously known only to experts on Turkey and Egypt, which we rather presumptuously applied to the Soviet nomenclature, suddenly explode in American politics? This is due to the credit or fault of two books. The first is titled The War Conspiracy. In it, Peter Scott, a literature professor from Berkeley, attempted to uncover the hidden mechanisms leading to wars. The attempt at uncovering was not particularly successful. There is a term for such studies: fringe. 20 years later, in 1993, Scott released his magnum opus, Deep Politics and the Death of Kennedy. In it, he claimed that the assassination of JFK was not a conspiracy of a single group but a systemic course correction for the United States, beneficial to intelligence agencies, the mafia, and big business. Conditionally, Kennedy was killed because he considered cutting military expenditures, which would negatively impact the military-industrial complex. Professor Scott was cunning. He did not directly say that the intelligence agencies killed Kennedy because, of course, he had no evidence and could not have any. He skirted around the sharp edges and merely insinuated, asking questions without providing any substance. Well, one person cannot simply take and kill an entire US president just because it was advantageous to the military-industrial complex. The same logic works if we were to accuse representatives of the sugar industry of conspiring with dentists and endocrinologists, so that we, after gorging on sweets, would then have to go to doctors, give them all our money, and treat our diseases due to the insane amount of carbohydrates consumed. Can't dentists be called beneficiaries of candy and gum ruining our teeth? They can. Does that mean that the World Federation of Dentists developed a secret plan with Coca-Cola and Mars to destroy our teeth and then restore them for $1 trillion? Well, if you have a vivid imagination, 100%. With a light hand by Professor Scott, the term deep state appeared. He borrowed it directly from Turkish newspapers. Scott was a pessimist, asserting that all key political decisions are dependent on hidden factors. We do not know their names. They operate beyond public control. This is what deep politics entails, and these processes involve far more people than we think. The deep state controls mainstream media and interferes in the private lives of citizens. It adjusts the country's course if, in its opinion, the White House or Congress deviates in the wrong direction. It was Peter Scott, not Donald Trump, who formulated and explained the concept of the deep state to the American audience. From that moment, the term took on a life of its own. When the work was released, historians and various social researchers were not inclined to give it any significance. It was obvious that there were no facts or scientific basis, more like fiction for a specific audience. However, as is often the case, the scientific world snobs underestimated how influential the conspiracy book would become in right-wing circles. After Donald Trump's first victory, the conspiracy term burst into the mainstream. Several prominent Trump supporters released books about the deep state's plans to overthrow the president and the hostile Washington swamp. Finding credible sources there is almost impossible, but the assassination attempt on Trump and a series of criminal cases only intensified these suspicions. The deep state ceased to be a marginal concept. It became a full-fledged element of political discourse, which those who previously scoffed, sighed, and dismissed people discussing the deep state seriously must now address. I've been discussing the American deep state for about 15 minutes, but I still haven't said what the deep state actually represents. You see, it depends on your perspective. It's not like there is a single deep state. Everyone hates their version, filling the term with unique content. The left sees the deep state primarily as military moguls and big business corrupting politicians through lobbyists, just as General Eisenhower and Bernie Sanders speak of it. If someone leans towards right-wing views, then intelligence agencies, globalists, and those who want to reduce the American population at all costs are certainly involved in the deep state. Donald Trump has never hidden his disdain for security agencies. The FBI, NSA, CIA are like red flags to him. He sees them as a repressive apparatus of the Democratic Party. The military, however, is another matter. It's hard to criticize them. After Vietnam, the military managed to restore its public reputation. Trump and his supporters have made the deep state an existential enemy of America. One of Trump's main promises for a second term, quote, dismantling the deep state brick by brick. Either the deep state will destroy us, or we will destroy it. Unlike his promises to build a giant wall with Mexico, Trump immediately got down to business and launched the Department of Government Efficiency. DOGE, a play on words with the Department of Justice, led by Elon Musk, embodies the idea of mass layoffs of officials and in quasi-governmental structures such as NGOs. At least half of the senior leadership of the United States, including the Attorney General, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of National Intelligence, can be considered proponents of the deep state theory. The deep state and Trump cannot exist without each other like quarrelsome spouses. An epic battle between them unfolds every day on social media and in the press. How this will all end, and whether the deep state will remain relevant in, say, the year 2030, we do not know. One thing is clear, to paraphrase Voltaire, if the deep state did not exist, it would be necessary to invent it. Thank you for watching till the end.